Chapter 13, in which several things go wrong at the same time, resulting in the sort of chaos that even chaos is confused by.
For I am certain that useless animal must have contributed just as much idiocy to this plan as you,
Horace said.
Is that not so, Sedovitz Tarpanu?
Sedovitz smiled at him. The Pajami's boiling rage dissipated. Oh, she said, while indicating Sedovitz. So you know this animal, do you? Horace's brow crumpled, wondering if he did indeed. Does his face ring a bell? She asked, fascinated. Horace continued to stare. He had seen this cat before. He did know this animal in some distant and uneasy way. Yes, she urged. Think, Horry, think. Where have you seen Sedovitz before, Oscar glanced around the table, wondering if this was his opportunity to get to the lever. But it was impossible. He needed distraction beyond this inflammatory tease. He needed some chaos, and it appeared Horace's brave attempt at making some had been staunched.
Where have I seen you?
Horace whispered.
Where?
I shall give you a clue, Horry, the Pajami said. It was 10 years ago. Does that perhaps help? Sedovitz's smile grew. I am hurt, he said. I thought you'd remember all your patients, especially those concealing sharpened tubes of worming ointment. Stunned, Horace staggered backwards and covered an eye in reflex. No, he cried. No, it cannot be. But the Pajami was bored now that the quiz was over. It can be, Horry, and was indeed so. I had to get you on the council somehow. Your being caught up in your medical practice left me little choice but to intervene. Don't look so surprised. You of all animals know I do not take kindly to refusal. No, Horace cried, stumbling over his chair. No! Oh, will you stop saying that? Surely I need only explain it once. But no amount of explanation would suffice. Horace was so distressed he'd have been better off returning to Chapter 1. The Pajami was insane of the mind, indeed both animals were, and pointing a shaking paw at Sedovitz, he said as much. Insane? Sedovitz said. Possibly, though I'd argue that insanity is merely the rationale of a visionary. Stunned, Horace gaped at him before turning to the Pajami. You once had honour, he cried, but you've changed, the Pajami. Oh, how you've changed. She smiled also. My dear Horry, you could never begin to understand. Change is merely a new way of looking at things. No, that is delusion, and I shall have no part in this madness. Indeed? And what are you going to do about it? Flee, perhaps? He stared at her while clamouring past animals frozen to their chairs. I shall not flee, he cried. I am not as cowardly as you might imagine, the Pajami. He staggered toward the corridor. I may not have battled you in argument over these years, but that's only because I knew your pig-headedness would respond by hastening this sort of madness. At its entrance, he stopped to glare. I would have expected more, he growled, particularly from my own sister. With that, he pushed at the door and strode through it, hoping guards might be called and a vicious struggle ensue, buying Oscar some time he could not otherwise begin to afford. Oscar just stared. Sister. And he looked at the Pajami. Horace's sister. But the old withered crone did not yell for guards, nor did she scream for him to be seized. Instead, she moved toward her wall of levers and rested a paw upon one of them. Turning, she watched Horace shuffle along the corridor, and then pulled at it. Beneath the dining hall, there was a clunk, followed by a muffled clanking of chain. From the corridor arose a rumble, and then a grating sound when a flagstone collapsed, leaving Horace to utter a strangled cry of surprise when he fell through the floor after it. With a cry, animals stood, and Oscar ran to the doorway. Sit! Screamed the Pajami. They froze, mid-stance. Any animal who offers similar resistance will disappear just as dreadfully. She indicated the assortment of levers like a game show host might a prize of gilded cutlery. They sat, quietly and scared, leaving the big-lipped dog to ask,
"Does that mean I can have his fish?"
Unaware of the drama unfolding next door, the Derby remained in the kitchen. She piled masses of crockery upon her paws, before dropping some of it, to blend in with the waiters doing the same. She didn't sob though, despite several of them being hysterical. By the door, a little dog sat on a stool and peered anxiously at a bell upon the wall. It was a rather ordinary bell, the Derby thought, and did little to warrant such attention, unless the dog had a fear of them, in which case he ought to sit elsewhere. More concerned for Oscar than a bellophobe, the Derby asked him to open the door for her. After another reluctant glance at the bell, the little dog did so. Hidden well by her teetering meals of food, she stepped past him and entered the dining hall. On doing so, she halted. The hall had none of the convivial dinner conversation she'd anticipated, and was instead frozen with the sort of discomfort one might expect in a play so dreadful, even the actors encouraged their audience to leave. Moreover, she was astonished to see Oscar starring in it. "What have you done?" he cried, turning to the Pajama. Rattling, the Derby turned also. The Pajama did not answer. Instead, she squinted at Oscar in the same manner Horace had at Sedovitz. Her eyes narrowed. She had seen this cat before. She did know this animal in some uncomfortable way. "Who are you?" she asked. "Ah, don't you start," Oscar swore, his prior concerns hammered by a need for revenge. He was livid, and he didn't care who knew it. Edging around the table, Sedovitz whispered in disbelief, "Well, well, what have we here?" "Who is he?" the Pajama growled. "Take off your hat," Sedovitz demanded, ignoring the Pajama as realization dawned. "I'd listen to you about as much as I would a broken radio," Oscar said, eager for the cat to get closer. He'd lay one on him this time all right, for trussing him up like a turkey, for betraying the Derby, for destroying Horace's career, and destroying Horace for that matter. Indeed, now seemed a good opportunity to have a go at the old bag as well, and have her guests realise what a truly ghastly creature she was, although cold-blooded murder of her brother probably sufficed. The Pajama, reaching the end of her tether, screamed, "Who are you?" Oscar levelled his gaze at her. "I'm the offspring of a prairie dog, remember?" he said. "Or was it an owl? Oh, sorry, I forgot how old you are, and you'd be hard-pressed to remember anything, especially considering the rubbish you've just spewed proves you have nothing resembling a brain." With a curse, Sedovitz lunged for Oscar's hat, but Oscar ducked from his paw, and with a sweep of his own, clobbered him hard on the nose. When the cat staggered backwards, the Derby couldn't help but cheer, which surrendered her concealment and had the Pajama turn to her. While Sedovitz reeled from assault, Oscar said to him, "The fundamental problem with stupid animals, Sedovitz, is that they're stupid." With that, he dealt him a swift uppercut, which laid the cat out on the floor. In a scream of revenge, the Pajama lunged at the Derby, who panicked and threw her mountain of crockery at the animal. Porcelain avalanched the cat and shattered across the floor, leaving guests to scatter from its shards. While the Pajama stumbled and screamed for guards, Oscar yelled at the Derby to break the levers. The Derby turned to the wall and threw herself at them, but their number left her overwhelmed. "Which one?" she yelled back. "The big one!" While the Pajama thrashed through mess, guards spilled into the dining hall's far side. Oscar, being closest to them, seized upon opportunity. "Arrest that one," he ordered, pointing at Sedovitz upon the floor. "Those three," and he pointed at a random assortment of guests. "And those two," indicating the big-lipped dog and his neighbour. While guards moved to do so, guests yelled at Oscar, and then at each other, and then at the guards, the big-lipped dog warning that if they laid a claw upon him, he'd gladly use them as cutlery. They hesitated in arresting Sedovitz, however, suspecting something wasn't right, which was confirmed when the Pajama screamed at them with the sort of unadulterated fury that the phrase had originally been invented for. But Oscar wasn't concerned about the Pajama's screams as much as her lunges at the Derby, and he leapt onto the table and bolted across it to do some lunging of his own. Once Sedovitz had been helped upright, the guards found their proper chain of command. With a paw against his jaw, Sedovitz indicated those requiring restraint. When the guards hurried away to obey, he swore at the growing chaos, and in particular the cat hurtling through the middle of it. With a growl, he turned and left, unfazed and unhurried. In the kitchen, the little dog in charge of bells had disappeared. So had the chefs and waiters. Sedovitz wasn't surprised. The Pajami's screams would have implied things were not going as planned, and no animal wished to be in her vicinity even when things were going to plan. Rummaging through drawers, he searched for some scissors, throwing drawers devoid of any across the kitchen. By the time he'd found a pair, the floor had been rendered unfit to be called one, and instead looked like an enormous drawer that contained, amongst other things, broken drawers. He snapped the scissors together, imagining Oscar's tail between them, and hurried from the kitchen toward the courtyard. The dervy's paws hesitated over the levers, her panic leaving her unconvinced breaking them would help matters. But when a piece of plate smashed into the wall beside her, she flinched and pulled at them regardless. The Pajami screamed at the guards to get her, the freak, away from my levers, while hurling crockery at her. With a yelp, the dervy ducked and whirled around to Oscar. The sight of him hurtling across the table filled her with resolve, and she wrenched the levers further. Beneath the dining hall, a rumbling began. More crockery smashed into the wall, and with another yelp, she flailed even harder. And then began a clunking. "The big lever!" Oscar yelled. "Break off the big lever!" With guards almost upon her, the dervy resorted to bashing them generically. A muffled boom rose from somewhere deep. Oscar slid into some meals of food. Grabbing one, he hurled it at some guards. One was struck squarely and fell, leaving another to stumble over him. When Oscar did the same to those on the table's other side, his flung chicken missed. With a curse, he retrieved from his collapsible tummy a fluff grenade. With a prime and a count, he threw it at the guards. There was a flash, a bang, and then a veritable world of fluff. Animals collapsed in a fit of coughs and splutters and got a dreadful dose of worms. He winced at the number of guests inadvertently included, which left him wondering whether he ought to apologise. There was then a cry from the dervy. The Pajami, having freed herself, lunged at her with as many claws as she could muster. With a lunge of his own, Oscar threw himself at another meal of food. Fumbling through its sauce, he got a grip and flung the thing. It slapped the Pajami in the back of the head. Stunned, she staggered sideways and swayed before slipping on something wet and nasty. In the reprieve afforded, the dervy flailed at levers as she'd never flailed before, and the floor began to shake. With inconsolable rage, the Pajami wrenched bits of fish and plate from her fur. Brandishing them as evidence, she screamed at guards, who were busy scratching their bottoms, that they arrest those responsible. A request embellished with expletives so anatomically outrageous that even the dervy stopped to look at her. The floor began to heave. In the corridor, flagstones lifted and fell to an abyss. No longer supported, its walls split and shifted, dragging the ceiling down in a collapse of stone. With a burst of rock and dust, the corridor fell apart and plunged after its flagstones. Rising from hidden depths, a billowing green fog massed and crept into the hall. When it enveloped animals closest, they gagged and threw themselves from its stench, sick squirting between their paws when dinner proved even more eager to flee than they. Their scarpering was hampered when the floor shook harder and shifted sideways. The hall's walls cracked like split earth, and ceiling began to rain, the whole thing clearly keen to follow the corridor's example. In a final slide, Oscar launched himself from the table, landed on the increasingly inaccurately named floor, and grabbed the dervy's paw. They stumbled through debris towards the kitchen until he also noticed the Pajami's hysteria. He stopped, dropped the dervy's paw, and turned. Beneath tortured structure, the Pajami screamed at them. With eyes wider than the plate she'd been hit with, she waved a paw at the lever as though claiming some bizarre victory. "Ha! See? It is done!" Despite the dervy's pleas that they just leave, Oscar trod over mounds of increasingly accurately named ceiling, picked up a chicken leg from amongst it, and stood before the Pajama. She was covered in dirt, dust and food, and had a preposterous edge of plate stuck to her head like some strangely fashionable hat. Her eyes were lit with a crazed and bizarre denial, and she stared at him obscenely, though finally bereft of words. Oscar said to her, "The only thing done around here, you decrepit old bag, is you." Whereupon he pulled her beard, fluffed her cheeks, and stuffed the chicken leg into her mouth. Beneath raining stone he growled, "You need to know that not only was this the worst dinner party I've ever attended, but that I wasn't even invited. So stick that in your catapult and fling it." She attempted something through her chicken leg, but Oscar just scoffed. "Head counsellor indeed," he sneered. "More like senile old cow." Her eyes widened, but he didn't care, far more concerned at how much longer the dining hall might remain resembling one. Bounding back through the mess, he grabbed the derby and pulled her toward the kitchens. "The courtyard," he said. "We need to get to the castle's courtyard." "What about Horace?" she cried. "Where is he?" Oscar's tummy knotted, firing him with determination. "He's already left the derby." The castle shook in a manner befitting something industrially designed to, thunder chasing them like a monster scraping claws beneath floor. They fled through the kitchen, saucepans spilled across their path and cupboards emptied in their wake. Oscar was left deafened, so the derby took the lead and dragged him through the mess, clattering across the floor. When they banged through a door, they found themselves in a corridor, and considering corridors' tendencies in this place, neither were keen to remain in it. Wrenching a flaming torch from the wall, Oscar muttered something incredulous, grabbed her paw and hurried its length. After some more thuds and a very disconcerting fizzing noise that Oscar suspected might have been him, they spilled into a room that had a stairwell leading upwards. He ran to the stairs and peered up into a parapet. "This is unlikely to lead to any courtyard," he said, holding the torch high. "More likely the battlements." The derby nodded. "So we continue on?" But before she could reply, the air shifted in thump. They froze, convinced that should either move, things would tip toward further fragility. When a muffled crack shook the floor, they fled nevertheless. Barreling through a maze of castle, they rounded a corner to find the path ended. They skittled to a stop and threw themselves at the dead end, as though its illusion might be proved. When it wasn't, they pounded at the stone, frantically trying to make it one.